Andrew Nash
Yep.
is the Deputy Director of the Institute of English Studies at the School of Advanced Studies at the University of London, in London, and we are in Reading at the Museum of English Rural Life in Reading. We're sitting in the Mark Longman Library, which is basically a collection, a comprehensive collection of books about books. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you.
You teach a course that relies on the records of British publishing houses for its foundation.
That's right. The course is called Using Publishers' Archives, and it's part of the London Rare Book School, which is run by the Institute of English Studies, which I am director of. And each year in the summer, we run around 15 or 16 courses on book-related topics intensively in a week. So each course runs for about 20 hours, taught intensively in a week. And the Publishers Archives course is one of those courses.
Okay. And who can come in and sign up for this?
Anybody. The entry requirement is we normally expect students to have an undergraduate degree or to have relevant professional experience.
What happens if you're just a book lover and a book collector? You don't get in?
Yes, you can do. Yeah. The reason why we stipulate an undergraduate degree is because the courses are deliberately pitched at master's level. Because you can take the London Rare Book School courses for University of London credit. So you can actually build up credit towards a master's program or a postgraduate certificate in the history of the book that is offered by the University of London.
Okay.
But frequently we do have general enthusiasts, book collectors, library and museum professionals who take our courses for professional development. And those who are interested in, just generally interested in books from a historical perspective, or perhaps they might have an interest in the contemporary rare book trade or the contemporary publishing trade, they will often take courses to learn more about the history of publishing or the history of books, going back to the medieval period. But we also run courses that focus on the contemporary publishing scene and on digital book history, the digital book of the 21st century.
And do all the attendees have grey hair?
No, not at all. No. The attendees are quite varied. We do draw in a number of people who are retired and have a general interest in the history of the book, or they may be book collectors. But we do have quite a lot of postgraduate students.
Talking about working with or using publishers' archives, maybe you can explain to me exactly, this is the course. So what do you do in that course?
Well, the course is called Using Publishers' Archives. Perhaps I should have called it Working with Publishers' Archives. So it's a unique opportunity for students to actually look at, research, work with documents that are commonly found in book trade archives. And the University of Reading, where we are today, is acknowledged as the main repository for book trade archives in the UK. And I can talk a little bit about that if it would help. Going back to the 1970s, when the university developed a collecting policy in this area. So we are uniquely placed to be able to expose students or people with an interest in the history of publishing to the records that have survived of major publishers, such as Chatto and Windus, Longmans, Macmillans, Jonathan Cape, Secker and Warburg, George Routledge. The list can go on.
Just you saying those names, it's so pleasing to hear those names.
Yes, and I think it's a characteristic of publishers. They tend to have exotic sounding names. The Heinemann portions of the historical Heinemann archive are also here.
Yeah.
The course doesn't just use the archives here at Reading. We're also able to introduce students to some of the collections held in the British Library in London, where in particular the archives of Richard Bentley and Son from the 19th century, and the Macmillan Archive, which is a very important archive in terms of the history of publishers' archives in Britain.
Right.
The moment when the British Library acquired the Macmillan Archive.
The British one, not the American one.
No, the British one only. It's seen as a foundational moment in the organisation of publishers' archives in Britain.
What does that mean?
Well, perhaps the best way to answer that question is to tell you a little bit about the history. In the 1960s, Macmillan, the publishing company Macmillan Britain, UK, decided that they wanted to get rid of their archive. Publishers are not archivists. This is an important thing to bear in mind. Publishers will keep records for the necessary day-to-day running of their business.
Well, and for income tax purposes or whatever,
Absolutely.
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And obviously the life cycle of a book, because of copyright, will extend over several decades. So keeping records is very important. But there will be large parts of a business's archive that it's not necessary for them to keep. It costs a lot to warehouse.
Like what?
Large parts of historical correspondence with printers or with booksellers, financial records that are no longer relevant to the day-to-day running of a business. So publishers will always have and have always had what you might call a sort of inconsistent attitude towards preserving their records. From a researcher's perspective, we like to think that every aspect of a publisher's business is important because it helps us understand more about the history of publishing.
Right.
But a business is going to think differently. So in the 1960s, when Macmillan decided they wanted to dispose of portions of their historical archive, the original plan was to sell the archive.
To some book dealer or some collector.
Indeed, yes.
Right.
And at the time, and this has become even more likely, the chances are that it would find its way over the Atlantic and be picked up by a US institution.
Yeah.
And to cut a long story short, what actually happened was that the archive was sorted by Simon Knowles Smith into material that would be kept and deposited in the British Museum Library, as it then was, material that would be sold on the open market, and material that would be got rid of what was known as the residue. And what actually happened was that what was deemed to be the most important material ended up at the British Museum Library.
What did he deem most important?
It tended to be the correspondence with major authors in the Macmillan Archive.
Yeah.
And the Macmillan Archive obviously has extensive correspondence with major literary authors such as W.B. Yeats, Thomas Hardy, and many others, and a lot of important non-fictional authors of the 19th century. What was known as the residual parts of the archive actually ended up here at the University of Reading. The way in which the Macmillan Archive was saved for the nation, that was actually the phrase that was used, was seen as an important moment retrospectively in the recognition that publishers' archives were important national cultural heritage and not just business.
Just like any other business, it's specifically important for cultural growth and development. And is that it?
That's right. Yes, I think the key word is heritage. That if you have embedded in publishers' archives extensive records of the publishing history of major literary authors, then that is part of the heritage of the country.
But so much of your heritage has gone over the pond.
Yeah.
Really. I mean, tons of it.
Yeah.
I mean, Ted Hughes is in Atlanta. And I think Philip Larkin wrote about this.
Yes, he did. Yes.
Yeah.
At the time of the acquisition of the Macmillan Archive. Yes, it was. That's right. And you're always going to get that collision between cultural imperatives and commercial imperatives.
Yeah.
and different publishers will have different attitudes towards this. The most famous recent example is the acquisition of the John Murray archive by the National Library of Scotland. What happened with the John Murray archive was that it was valued by Quaritch. I think it was £45 million or something. But
this was Murray is still active, and they went to Quaritch and they said, "Can you look at this?"
Yes,
yeah,
and valued the archive.
Okay,
but Murray had a very benevolent attitude towards heritage, and they wanted the National Library of Scotland to acquire the archive, and eventually, through a series of money-raising activities and also a grant from, I believe it was from the Heritage Lottery Fund at the time, the archive was acquired by the National Library of Scotland for considerably less than that valuation at Quaritch.
Okay. This was done as a service to the country.
Yes, absolutely. And it wasn't the case that the money went and lined the pockets of the Murray family, because it was actually fed back into a series of educational initiatives around the archive, so that the archive was made accessible to the public.
Right.
And educational activities were built around it using the money that had been raised to purchase it. So that story, which has been written about very extensively by David Maclay, who was the first curator of that collection, is a really good example of the attitude, the recognition, I suppose, that publishers' archives contain very, very valuable heritage materials.
So why is it so valuable then? Drill down on that for me.
Well, I suppose you might say that publishers' archives have more than one kind of value. They have a commercial value, because they might contain considerable amounts of papers relating to major literary figures. In the case of the John Murray archive, Byron, Jane Austen, many others, Darwin. But there's also that sense of cultural value. Jane Austen is on the £10 note. So there is an indicator of the way in which an author is perceived as part of national cultural heritage. So a business archive, a book trade archive, can contain these elements of cultural heritage, and you're always going to get that kind of collision between the cultural and the commercial, business and heritage.
Right, okay. So tell me what you do with the material that's here then. Like, what do you bring your students in, and like, what do they actually look at, and what do you tell them?
Okay, well, the course is designed to do several things. It introduces students to the varied nature of publishers' archives, because publishers' archives, because they are business archives, and indeed book trade archives generally, are not collected. They don't take the form of other kinds of archives, such as the archive of an author, which might generally contain almost exclusively correspondence of that author, or perhaps manuscripts of that author. So on the one hand, the course is designed to raise awareness of the unusual nature of publishers' archives. So I'm particularly keen to introduce students to the different kinds of material that you might find in a publisher's archives, why that material has survived and why other material might have been lost.
What do you find in the publisher's archive then? Like, what do you find?
Typically, you will find correspondence between a publisher and its authors, correspondence between a publisher and other agents in the book trade, so correspondence with printers, correspondence with booksellers, correspondence with publishers' representatives or travellers. The archive here, the George Routledge archive here, has got some wonderful files from the 1930s of correspondence between the sales manager at George Routledge and the publisher's travellers. They had one traveller for the north of England and Scotland. They had one traveller for the south of England. They had one traveller for London. And you can get a very interesting insight into the way that books were distributed, the relationship between the bookseller and the publisher through this travelling salesman who would take inspection copies, dust wrappers, and try and get advance orders. Dummies. So the correspondence can be really very varied. Now, a lot of people who use publishers' archives are interested in the publishing history of individual authors, so they tend to dive in and look for letters from Thomas Hardy to Macmillan or whatever it might be.
That's the kind of point of entry.
That tends to be. Yeah. What I'm trying to do on my course is to show that if you want to understand the history of publishing, you've got to look at the larger picture. So that just diving in to look at the author-publisher relationship in the Routledge archive is only going to tell you so much. If you were to look at the correspondence between the sales manager and the publisher's traveller, you get a sense of what booksellers were thinking about this book that was about to be published by this famous author or whatever it might be, and how that book actually made its journey.
And why is that important?
I believe it's important because it helps us to draw up the links in the chain in which books are disseminated. I can give you an example. A very famous book that Routledge published in the 1930s, To Beg I Am Ashamed, which was published under the name Sheila Cousins. And it was, or purported to be, the memoirs of a prostitute. And there's always been a considerable debate about the authorship of this book. What's interesting in the files...
A pseudonym, isn't it?
It's a pseudonym. What's interesting about the files with the publisher's travellers is that we get an insight into the moment when the booksellers decided that they would not stock this book for moral reasons.
So they were the gatekeepers.
They were the gatekeepers, yeah.
So it gives you a sense of how powerful they are in terms of what people are thinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Isn't that interesting?
But it's important to say that correspondence is only a small part or one part of a publisher's archive. And in some instances, it might be actually a missing part. The Longman archive, which is here, which dates back to the 18th century, to the inception of the firm, but has huge gaps caused by periods of the firm's history where their records were lost.
Lost or destroyed
destroyed. In their particular instance, through fire, through enemy action in the Second World War, when Paternoster Row, as you don't know, was flattened one night, and considerable amount of the records of publishers were destroyed.
And books themselves.
And books themselves, the stock. Yes, particularly with Simpkin Marshall, the leading wholesaler. So the Longman archive, actually, its richness lies not in its correspondence, at least certainly for the 18th and 19th century part of it. The post-war part is very rich in correspondence. But in the older part, the richness lies in its financial records. And the financial records are another part of publishers' archives that I concentrate on in this course. And that can be a very unfamiliar part of publishing for students, and it can involve exposure to documentary material that is quite intimidating, quite unusual.
Especially for bookish types.
For bookish types, because they're not necessarily used to dealing with math. Indeed, yes, 19th century record keeping in particular was very eccentric, not at all uniform. I mean, it did follow certain patterns that are discernible. Double entry bookkeeping is sort of visible there. But it's the nature of the history of publishing that the contractual arrangements between authors and publishers would vary from book to book. And so different arrangements would require different kinds of bookkeeping, because publishers needed to record some kind of information for one book, and they didn't need to record the same information for another book.
If they paid in advance, for example.
Yes. If an author was being remunerated on a half-profit system, the publisher needed to record all of the costs of production and all the sales in order to be able to determine what portion of profit would be paid over to the author. But if they
the author would want to have a look at that too, obviously, theoretically, for proof of what they should be paid.
Yeah.
Even though it's the publisher that's doing the recording.
Yeah. And in the 19th century, I mean, you're touching on a very interesting aspect of the history of publishing and the history of authorship there, because in the 19th century in Britain, publishers didn't routinely share that information with authors. And one of the main driving forces behind the formation of the Incorporated Society of Authors in the 1880s was I wouldn't call it a belief, but a suspicion that some publishers that they were getting ripped off. That the publishers were inflating production costs, and without being able to vet these books, authors had no way of knowing for certain that they weren't being, if not diddled, then at least sort of being done out of perhaps their total rewards.
So wouldn't they'd want to see an audited version? They'd want to see some sort of neutral, review of this, if there is such a thing, to prove that either they were getting shafted or they weren't, right?
Yes.
So how could they do that?
Well, they lobbied. They pushed very hard for this.
But how? Even if you're looking at the publisher's books, how do you know that they aren't bullshit?
Yeah. Well,
how do you know?
Well, you don't know. You don't know.
So you just have to trust.
You have to trust, and trust and mistrust is part of the history of publishing. Is Barabbas a publisher?
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? So it's really shows you how important it is for an author to find someone that they can actually trust and think is honest.
Yes, and that's part of the history of publishing, isn't it? Some authors had very close relations with their publishers.
Yeah,
looked upon their publishers as part of the production process, partners, if you like, in the cultural process of creating their work.
Yeah.
Other authors looked upon publishers as intermediaries between their work and the public that consumed their work. But
just the rise of the literary agent is also involved here because often the author doesn't want to get into this yucky conversation about money. They'll just leave that to their agent.
Indeed, and in Britain, the literary agent arrives in the 1880s, late 1870s, early 1880s, at around about the same time as
that Watt?
Yes, A.P. Watt is
the big one,
acknowledged as the first professional. He comes into business, or he starts his business just before the Incorporated Society of Authors comes into being. So in the 1880s you have these various moments which is seen very much as part of the increasing professionalization of authorship. And the literary agent emerges in part because literary property has become so varied and so diverse. The different rights that could be associated with a literary work, serial rights, volume rights, overseas rights, colonial rights, and translation rights.
And then starting in the 20s, movie rights.
Yes, that's right, yes. Yeah. And all of this you can track, of course, in publishers' archives.
The growth of all these other subsidiaries.
That's right. And one of the things that can emerge from publishers' archives is that a lot of sort of misunderstandings about the history of publishing can be corrected. A publisher like Chatto & Windus, for example, responded very positively to the emergence of the literary agent. Some publishers, such as William Heinemann, looked upon the agent as a parasite. Coming between the author and the publisher, disrupting that relationship.
And the importance of that relationship too, and like part of the reason that these publishers got into business in the first place was, hey, I get to hang out with some of the coolest people in the country, and I become friends with them.
Yes, it's always been a very clubbable profession. Yeah, it's a very, and indeed, dating back into the 19th century, when a lot of business was done at trade dinners. Publishers like Longman's and John Murray would hold trade dinners where discounted sales of books would take place, and authors and publishers and booksellers would all congregate and have a lavish meal, and it was very clubbable and very gentlemanly, and of course very, very male in its culture, the 19th century. To come back to the financial records, the different kinds of financial records that students on the course are introduced to, when we get into the 20th century and the bookkeeping becomes more transparent, students can actually work out from the bookkeeping how much an author was paid, how much they received. When the royalty system becomes the standard method of remunerating authors in Britain, which is much later than it is in the US, for example.
Why is that?
A very good question. I think that would be an excellent question to put on an examination paper or to set as an essay. It's got a lot to do with the habit of publishers in the 19th century. A considerable number of publishers like to purchase books outright. Yeah. And then as the number of rights that could be associated with literary work grew in the 19th century, authors were more keen, and they were encouraged by the Society of Authors not to sell books outright, because these subsidiary rights would be protected. When the royalty system comes in, and by the 20th century it's standard, the standard way of recording the costs of production and the payments made to author was through double entry bookkeeping, profit and loss. And students on the course, I present them with examples of big ledgers where they can actually look at and work out the costs of production of the first edition of a book, the royalty that was paid to the author. Be helpful.
Sorry, do you see the bills? Like, you see the bills from the printer and the binder and whatever color work that they might have to do, or all these other different things. You see all that, right?
They tend not to survive.
Right.
And the actual bills themselves.
So it's just a kind of a ledger.
It's a ledger which records the costs.
I see. Okay.
But that does allow students to see at a glance the relative costs of the different components of producing a book. Paper, machining costs, binding, advertising, which is obviously another whole category.
You could also see one publishing house maybe pays a certain amount, but they use this one printer or paper supplier. Another one uses different companies, different suppliers. You can see, who's the most expensive in that category.
Yes, you can do. And there's a very good example of that. Again, a collection here, the Allen and Unwin collection, which goes back actually to firms out of which Allen and Unwin emerged, Swan, Sonnenschein and George Allen and Co. So the archive here is really extensive. It goes back to the early to the late 19th century. But the Allen and Unwin archive and Stanley Unwin, obviously a major figure in 20th century
wrote
British
the book.
publishing.
Wrote the
book, the truth about publishing.
Yes.
But it's an interesting example because for most of his books, Stanley Unwin used as the printer Unwin Brothers. So the family printing firm. And it's evident from the archive that the cost of printing for Unwin was much lower than it would be if he had used a different firm than his family firm, the Unwin Brothers.
But he would have showed to the author, he wouldn't have showed that. Would the author have benefited from that relationship or not?
I think by the time we get to the 1920s and 30s, when Unwin is in business I think the dealing was much more transparent, and authors would have had access to that information, and the trust would have been there.
Yeah.
So the reduced production costs that Unwin incurred through being able to use Unwin Brothers as his printer would have resulted in greater benefits for the author, because reduced production costs therefore meant a greater profit.
As a collector, I would, what would be interesting for me is to see which books had the best quality paper supplier, for example. Like, it seems to me that you would be able to find things out about the quality of that book production, and that might be of interest to a collector.
I think it would, to do that. It would be quite a...
Would it give the names of the suppliers?
Yes, in some instances you would probably have to cross-reference that to other parts of the archive, so that within the outgoing correspondence would be letters to suppliers, or you would have to cross-reference to the printers, so that you know. But commonly it would, certainly in the 19th century, the ledgers that I've seen and that I've worked with, you are able to trace the paper supplier.
Right.
But that would be quite a large undertaking if you wanted to trace the different quality of book, and work out the paper cost, the cost of the paper for different kinds of quality paper. You would have to do quite an extensive piece of research, but that is certainly what an archive, publisher's archives, can allow you to do.
Okay, so the way that you do it, you told me basically what you do. The way that you do it is you go out to these different facilities, one here in Reading and British Museum or British Library, and so they have a look at the stuff. And then what do you do?
I like to give the students periods of time where they are just looking at the material,
handling it,
working their way through it. Obviously, I've chosen the material carefully in the hope that it will elicit certain kinds of information, but students always surprise you by picking out things that you hadn't noticed, or drawing conclusions that you hadn't expected. To take one example, the Chatto and Windus archive has an excellent collection, a record of their advertising. They have a series, an uninterrupted series from around about 1917, I think, of all of the adverts that they placed in newspapers, in magazines.
They actually have pages, what are they called? Anyway, there's a name for that when you get the ad back, just to prove that you did your ad appeared in the...
I think that's probably what it is.
That's what they've got.
Yes, they've done, and they're pasted into a letter book or a ledger book, so that you can actually work your way through and trace. You can see the ads, and you can also see the cost of the ad, and that's one of the most fascinating things. So each advertisement above it has got, usually in red ink, it's wonderful, a recorded cost of placing that advertisement. What I do is I usually make the students work in pairs. I give them a book, and I say, right, I want you to trace all of the adverts of this particular book over a 1 year period, or whatever it might be, and just draw out anything that you find interesting. And they tend to focus on the presentation, the use of quotes from reviews, the style. Famously, in the 1930s, Victor Gollancz has used a very aggressive form of advertising. With...
Do you use color, like purple and yellow, or...?
Tended to be black and white. But Gollancz was an innovator in terms of type design and that way of arresting the eye. Chatto and Windus was much more sober, tended to rely more on words rather than visual display. But it's still very interesting for students to see when a work is evidently become a success, then there's a lot more adverts.
You mean, sorry, there is proof that the more you advertise, the more you sell. Is that what you're saying?
No, I think the proof is the other way around. The more you sell, the more you advertise.
So you've got a hit. You realize you've got a hit, so you push it.
You push it, yes.
Right.
And that is actually what Stanley Unwin says in The Truth About Publishing. It's what other publishers of the 20s and 30s say is the nature of advertising. And it's borne out by these advertisements. So a work like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, for example, which is one of the examples that I give the students to look at. Sparse advertisements, and then all of a sudden advertisements on their own. So that initially his Brave New World might appear as part of a group of newly published titles.
1932.
And then all of a sudden it's being advertised on its own, sometimes without nothing more than just the title.
Well, they should use the cover because it's brilliant.
Yeah, it's a wonderful cover.
Brilliant.
Yes. So to go back to what would actually happen in the classroom, students would have half an hour or so looking at these advertisements and drawing out anything that takes their interest. They are struck when if they don't immediately look at the cost of these advertisements, and I direct them to look at them, they are struck by the amount of money that was expended on advertising by publishers, and that has always been the case.
Like what, 10% of the production
Pretty much,
value?
yes. I mean, you're putting me on the spot to come up with something there. I would say at least that.
It's funny, though. You hear publishers talking about the fact that advertising is a waste of money. You hear that often.
Yeah.
But it's not? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think it goes back to what we said, that the more a book sells, the more you advertise it, because you're pushing your surefire winner.
You've already got like a bit of a buzz. You got word of mouth, and as we've said, you're sort of helping that word of mouth along. Is that it?
Yes, that's right. And in fact, to give you an example from a much later period that's not from the archival records, there was a very effective and famous television advertisement of Jeffrey Archer. I can't remember which of his best-selling novels it was. And it featured a goldfish swimming around a bowl, repeating on loop, "Do you know this book has sold 1 million copies? Do you know this book has sold 1 million copies?" So playing into our understanding of goldfish having no memory, or there's no brain, or whatever. But that will make you want to buy the book, because if 1 million copies have been sold, you could be the 1,001st sort of thing.
You could be with a crowd of people who are in the know, or it seems to me that that's what the message is that, well, if they sold 1 million, it must be good.
Absolutely, yeah, it is that. That's how they're going to sell their next 1 million. Whereas
was he in prison at that time?
No. Whereas the book that sold 150 is not worth pushing.
Right. Yeah, that's it. You can't push a dud. So what? It has to have a certain amount of legs just on its own before you've done any promotion, and then you kind of look through your sales and you say, okay, this one's getting a bit better. Let's add. That's where we advertise.
Yes, that's certainly what the evidence suggests from these archives, and it worked certainly. That's another example of another type of documentary material that you will find in publishers' archives.
Right.
The Chatto and Windus advertisements books just happen to be a really useful source for exploring the way publishers advertise books, because they're all in one place. Because you've got this record of the advertisements pasted into books.
Right.
In other archives, a publisher might not have kept a record in this way, or if they did, they might not have codified it in this way. So it becomes more difficult to teach, more difficult to draw out. And all the time, what I'm encouraging my students to do is to reflect on that, to reflect on the internal organization of an archive. Okay,
so reflect on the fact that the publisher has decided to keep these records and not those records, and why?
Yes, but also to organize the records in that way. And to give you another example, we spend the final 2 sessions on the course looking at the archive of Gerald Duckworth, a publisher set up, as you know, in the late 19th century, running through various sort of different forms really in the 20th century. And that archive is housed in Senate House Library, which is the library of the University of London. But more so even than Longman, it was the victim of fires and enemy action, and only portions of the archive remain, and it really exists in two parts, two tranches, one from the 20s and 30s and one from the 70s, 80s and 90s. So in the portion of the archive from the 1920s and 1930s is organised in a completely different way from the portion that's preserved from the 1970s, 80s and 90s. So the earlier part of the archive is organised into files chronologically and alphabetically by the recipient of the letter.
Right.
So you would have, say, for 1931 A, January to March. So all of the correspondence beginning with A in one file from January to March 1931.
A to Z.
Yeah. Now that can be maddening if you are trying to trace the publishing history of an individual title, because the letter to the author Arnold, let's say, would be in the A file, but the letter to the printer pertaining to the publication of that book might be in the C archive for close. Presenting students with that kind of material is an introduction to the difficulty of working with this material.
You want it to be recorded by book.
Well,
that's what you want.
That's generally what a researcher would want if they are researching the publishing history of an individual author or an individual title. And that is how the latter part of the archive is organised from the 70s, 80s and 90s. It is organised by author. So, for example, one of Duckworth's major authors from the 70s and 80s, Beryl Bainbridge, you have files relating to the publishing of her individual titles, but you also have files relating to the translation rights of her individual titles. And in the final session, I hand out all of the different files by different translation, the French translations, the German translation, what was then labelled the Czechoslovak translation.
With all their lovely different dust jackets? Or
No, it's a record of the negotiation
okay.
with translators.
How much we got for
with the publishers. Often it's a record of failed, a negotiation with a translator who wants to produce a translation of a novel, but then also a negotiation with potential publishers of that translation. So you have two phases of negotiation,
right.
And quite often it wouldn't lead to a published book, because
wouldn't the publishing house be responsible for getting their own translation, and they just pay directly for it and then turn it over to their translator?
That would vary from book to book. With an author like Bainbridge, they would actively seek translator because there was every chance that her works would sell in translated form. For less high-profile authors, then it would not be uncommon for publishers to receive approaches from potential translators interested in
translators or publishing houses?
Both. So translators might come and say, directly, I have interested
doing this myself, and then I will sell my translation to whomever in Russia or wherever.
That might happen, yes. They might have already made an arrangement, or there would be an arrangement between the two publishers. That could vary. So these files can open up those sorts of questions, precisely the questions that you're asking about how did a publisher handle the translation of the works that they published. And
why is this of interest?
For me, it's of an interest because it shows students the internationalism of publishing in the period, and that could apply to any period. It's also, I think, it's quite interesting to show students records of failed attempts to get publishing projects off the ground. Just looking at the relative size of the files, as you might imagine, translation into French and German, great big fat files, translation into Slavic languages generally quite slim files, but
that's profit motive too.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. But it does help students understand the nature of a publishing business in whatever period you're looking at, to be able to look beyond the author-publisher correspondence, to
Yeah.
look at other
Yeah.
aspects of the circulation and distribution of books.
And generation of revenue.
Absolutely.
Okay, why does this matter generally? What you're doing, like it's, like understanding what publishers' archives mean to us.
Well, I think that it'll matter generally, or mean things to different people. My own background is in English literature, the study of English literature. And I became very interested in understanding how books came to be in the form in which they appeared in my hand when I was reading them. So looking at the material conditions of composition, production and reception, for me, enriched my knowledge and understanding of a book as it appeared, sort of knowing how that book came into being. Certainly as a teacher of English literature in universities, it always struck me that there was a tendency for students to be completely oblivious about the way in which their copy of Oliver Twist, for example, in whatever edition they were using, ignorant or innocent about how it came to be in the form in which it appeared to them in the copy that they were using. And that's what led me to take an interest in publishing history. But other people, perhaps with an interest in economic history or business history, are interested in publishers and publishers' records as part of understanding the changing nature of business and economics in whatever historical period they're looking at.
Still doesn't tell me why it's important. Why should anyone study this?
Well, what you're effectively asking is, why is the study of history important? Why is the study of the humanities important? So, carriers of information, carriers of culture, they are an experience that most people can relate to. Before we arrived in this building today, you told me that you had looked at an exhibition of ladybird books that is on display here at the Museum of English Rural Life, and we both commented that we were brought up on ladybird books. That's a personal element, a personal engagement. If I think of an aspect of my childhood, it involves an engagement with books, and it involves an engagement with a particular publishing phenomenon.
And an appearance.
A visual, a tactile relationship with books, a visual response to books. And surely the study of books, therefore, is the study of culture. It's a study of social history. Studying books and studying publishing, you have to draw on so many different kinds of history. You have to draw on social history, cultural history, economic history.
History of the imagination.
History. Yeah, history of the imagination, literary history, or the history of aesthetics. You have to be skilled in understanding economics, history, literature, language. It's very easy to think that the history of the book is everything. I think the study of the book and the study of publishing is a way of studying history.
Darnton's early work, it's just fascinating how he traces the smuggling of books in from outside of France.
Yes, and of course there have been various rewritings of Darnton's communications circuit. Yes, various people have applied it, because Darnton was very upfront about the fact that he was a historian of the Enlightenment. His diagram pertained particularly to the Enlightenment. There's a very interesting essay by Claire Squires and Padmini Ray Murray on redesigning the communications circuit for the digital book and for 21st century publishing. And they do some very imaginative things about the different relations between authors and publishers, publishers and booksellers, authors and readers, and how it's changed. Publishers' archives, I think, can help open up Darnton's communications circuit in a very interesting way, because you can take a discrete, admittedly vast and inchoate collection of material, and you can see the links between authors and publishers, agents and publishers, publishers and booksellers,
The relationship.
the
Yes.
relationships
Yeah.
at any
Yeah.
one period
Yeah.
of time.
It's interesting because that's exactly what early on I kind of, in doing this podcast, and I've been doing it for more than 10 years. It's Darnton's communication circuit, and I wanted to identify as many different people along that circuit who I could talk to, who are best practitioners, so I could get a good overview of not that circuit, but the circuit that we're living through,
That
or
we're living
working
through.
with.
Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also the case, certainly in my experience, that whenever you teach the history of the book, you almost always end up talking about the contemporary. You end up talking about students' engagement with books, because as often as not, you're teaching the history of the book, the history of publishing, the history of reading to people who are avid readers. So they understand their own relationship with the different players. They understand their own relationship with booksellers. I always ask my students, for example, how do you go about acquiring your books? Particularly relevant question in these days of Amazon and internet bookselling. But a surprisingly large number will say, I absolutely am committed to bookshops. I love going into bookshops. That then allows you to provide an interesting contemporary context for understanding the history of bookshops. Without wanting to go off topic, this year at the London Rare Book School, for the first time, we ran a course on the history of bookshops and bookselling. Specifically, that environment, the space of bookselling and the way it's changed through history.
Cultural oases is what they are in different communities.
Yeah. And understanding the historical dimension of that can really illuminate the contemporary.
And help the contemporary to survive.
Yes, indeed. So to come back to Darnton's communication circuit, one body of material we haven't spoken about yet that I'm always interested in introducing students to are, there's two kinds of material, and I group them together in a session called The Receipt of Manuscripts. And we look at examples from the Alan Unwin archive of readers' reports. And we also look at an example, a body of material from the Chatto and Windus archive of their manuscript entry books. So in the 19th century and for much of the 20th century, whenever a manuscript was received by Chatto, they kept a record of it. The date a decision was made on it, the communication with the author, and quite often a one-line summary of why the book was rejected or why the book was accepted.
It's a risk assessment, which is so interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like a commercial decision, connecting the commercial with the artistic. It's saying, are we going to make money off this work of art?
Yes, yeah. But it also gives an insight into the sheer scale of the business, because these manuscript entry books, and again, I encourage the students to spend 20 minutes or so just leafing through them. Every book that was accepted is underlined in red. And you would be amazed, it's about 5% of the manuscripts that they received.
Is that a lot or a little?
I think that's, on the face of it, quite a little, really.
I don't know about that. Given the number of manuscripts they receive.
Well, be that as it may, what it does indicate surely is the sheer amount of business, reading of manuscripts or consideration of manuscript that went on, that was required in that period. The readers' reports that we look at, that I select the Alan Unwin archive mainly because they used a lot of outside readers. Some publishers would employ readers or would actually have a member of the firm as their designated reader. Others would use outside readers, and because Alan Unwin published a lot of non-fiction books, technical books on politics, economics and so on, they frequently used experts, often experts associated with universities. And just seeing the different style of these reports and addressing what you said earlier about the risk assessment, the competing demands.
That's the most important criteria for a reader. You want them to pick the right one that's going to make you money. I mean, sure, you want an important book to put your name on. Yeah. But are we going to make money at this or not? So it wouldn't matter if they're an expert in a certain field. You want someone who's got a feel for if this is going to make
For what
money
will
or
sell.
not.
Yes, for
Yeah.
what will sell. But it is both of those things, though. It is putting your name to an important book. At different periods of time, a
Yeah.
publisher might have a different attitude towards wanting to acquire books that will be sure sellers and wanting to acquire books that will create prestige for the
Yeah.
imprint.
It depends on how fat the bank account is.
Yes, and that again is something that can jump out at students when they perhaps encounter a book that receives a really negative report and yet was still published,
Yeah.
or conversely, a book that receives a very positive report and wasn't published.
This is so interesting, isn't it? It's like if you look at the bank account, that'll tell you a lot. Is how much they got in the bank, and then as you say, it's like, okay, well, we can afford to do this great book, whereas 2 years ago it may not have been published by that company.
That's right. Yes, and in fact, of course, an important part of some publishers' archives are those financial records that are unrelated to the book publishing business. And these are parts of archives that are not routinely consulted by researchers, and I don't use them on this course, although perhaps I should. Again, Allen and Unwin, an excellent example of this, and here I must credit a graduate student of mine who's working on the financial history of the Allen and Unwin firm. And one of the things she detected was that the financial survival of the firm up until about the 1950s, when it had its first bestseller, The Kon-Tiki Expedition, came about not through the sales of books, but it came about through its property dealings. And Stanley Unwin's nous in acquiring various properties in his own name and investing that into the company. So the company was pretty much kept afloat by non-book publishing related income, which was then, supported a book publishing operation. So I think it is important to remember that publishers are not just, from a financial perspective and a commercial perspective, not necessarily only interested in books.
You have to have a certain amount of money to risk to be in the business. It's the gentleman's business. It's perhaps a business of the wealthy up to a certain date. Would you say that's accurate?
I think
I don't know.
I think it varies.
Right.
Yeah, I would be cautious in putting an opinion on that myself. But
Yeah.
I do know that in the 19th century, it was the amount of capital required wasn't as great as it was to become in the 20th century.
Okay.
And there are complicated reasons for that, which is partly to do with the way in which businesses operated. They sort of operated actually largely as undercapitalized businesses, and they were dependent upon each other really for sustaining a financial viability.
They didn't have to pay the big advances.
No.
Often the author shouldered some of the costs.
Yes.
Yeah. Just before we close, I'm thinking of Alan Unwin. I'm thinking of The Hobbit. Any need to look at that at all?
Not on the course,
No.
but again, actually, The Hobbit is a really good example, or Tolkien generally is a good example of another part of another kind of material that you commonly find in publishers' archives, which is records of illustrations and dust jackets. Alan Unwin has some interesting material on this. The Hogarth Press, which is also housed here at the University of Reading.
Does that go right back to Virginia Woolf?
Yes.
Table?
Yes.
Kitchen
Yes.
table? Does.
Yeah.
That's great.
And so and they have a lot of the surviving illustrations, the original designs for the illustrations. Also, that's true of Chatto and Windus as well. So you can there's a real sort of visual element of the archives. So again, if I had 2 weeks for this course rather than 1 week, then an exploration of the history of book illustration through the records that remain in publishers' archives would be a very fruitful session.
Well, this has been so fruitful. I've just really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you Andrew Nash. Now, how can people sign up for the course?
Well, the London Rare Book School next year will run in the final 2 weeks of June.
Okay.
And we will be finalising the list of courses around about September, October, and we open for business in November.
November of 23.
November
now.
of 23
Yeah, okay.
for the courses that will run in June 2024. And the Using Publishers Archives course will run alongside, I think, probably around 11 other courses addressing different aspects of the book. It will include courses on bookbinding, on illumination in medieval manuscripts, a course on the modern rare book trade, a course on a history of book collecting, and many others.
Wonderful. And do you have an address off the top of your head, an email or a website, or they just Google?
If you Google London Rare Book School, you'll find us.
Very
You'll
good.
find your way to the Institute of English Studies website, where you'll be able to get all the information.
Fantastic. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you.